Good morning. Do you guys know who the greatest financier in the Bible was? Now, some people think that it was Pharaoh's daughter because she went down to the river and drew out a little profit. But I tell you that it was actually Noah, because Noah was floating his stock while everyone else was in liquidation. Yeah. I know. But I had to make sure you were awake, right? I mean, that's kind of what we have here. Okay, all right. Enough of the bad jokes, and let's move on. Okay, so if you were here 10 days ago on Wednesday night, I shared the introduction to this topic that I'm going to be dealing with this morning. So for those of you that were here, we might have a little bit of a review. For those of you that weren't here, well, I don't know why you weren't here, but we'll get on with this. So, in our house at this time of year, we have a banner hanging in our house, and it says this: "Wise men still seek him." Now, this quote or this banner could imply a couple of things. Number one, the wise man is speaking of here maybe have not found him yet. Okay, that would make sense. Treasure hunters continue to look for the buried treasure until they find it. Usually, though, once they find it, it's not enough, and they go off and they search for another treasure. See, sometimes treasure hunters, their whole goal is to search. The search is what they're all about, right? It is certainly reasonable to think that if the wise men still seek him, that they haven't found him yet. Or maybe they have found him, but they didn't recognize him, much like the Jews did during Jesus' time. And Jews today, they've been looking for Jesus for all this time. They don't recognize him. He looks different. But what if the quote implied something else? It could imply that they have found him, but they still seek him. But why? Why would they still seek something that they've already found? A.W. Tozer, in his book, The Pursuit of God, which I'm going to take a few quotes from today, says it like this: "To have found God and still to pursue him is the soul's paradox of love." A paradox is something that often doesn't make sense. But many times it actually makes complete sense when you put it towards a singular purpose. So, if we found Jesus, but yet we still search for him, or we still pursue him, we're still looking for him, this is actually a paradox for us. It actually comes out of our love. Once we find Jesus, that's actually only the beginning of our journey of seeking him. Okay? Sometimes, if we're seeking something, if you've ever been Christmas shopping, if you Christmas shop like I do, okay, most of the guys in the room are probably this way. I make a list of things that I need. I map out exactly where I think this thing ought to be in the store. I get to the store. I plan my attack by trying to go at the moment where I think the least amount of people are going to be there. I'm always wrong. But I walk in, I dart to the one spot where that one thing that I'm looking for is. I grab it and I go to the nearest or the least amount of people checkout. Sometimes you used to be able to, you go to Walmart and you buy something in the back, you just go over to the sporting goods counter and pay there, and you could just walk out. No hassle. All right? They don't always let you do that anymore. But as soon as I found what I had, I was paying and I was getting out. I found my treasure, I've gotten it, and I've left. Right? That's how we are sometimes. We look for something and we say, okay, I found Jesus. That's it. That's all I've got to do. Or, let's take it a step further. I found Jesus and I took a dip in the water. Now I'm good. But see, I think that causes some problems for us. Because it's not just about that. So, for the purposes of today, I'm going to define seeking God as this: to search diligently for the presence of God and to desire and to attempt to make direct contact with God. Or to phrase it up, to literally yearn to be in his presence. Okay? So, everything I do today is going to be based off of this definition. Now, this is kind of taken from the dictionary. It's kind of taken from the Bible, and it's kind of taken from my own words. But literally, I believe that to seek God means to literally yearn to be in his presence. Okay? Now, let's take a look at a couple of our patriarchs. Okay? You see, a couple of our patriarchs, and probably more than a couple, I'm only going to share a couple today, understood that being in the presence of God was of the utmost importance. Moses was literally spoken to by God from a burning bush. But Moses wanted to see God's glory. He wanted to see him. And God, in essence, said to him, you can't see my full glory. You can't. But I'll let you see part of it. Okay? In essence, he said, here's my back. I'm going to go by really quickly, and you're going to be able to see me. But if you were to see my full glory, it would surely kill you. Right? You'd be dead. His glory is so amazing. Moses understood. Even though God was talking to him. Imagine that for a second. Imagine being Adam or Moses or any of the prophets that God literally spoke to directly. And imagine him thinking, this is great, but I really just want to see you. I want to see your glory. I want to see your presence. I want to be in your presence. Right? What about David? King David, who is referred to as a man after God's own heart, begged God not to take his spirit away from him in Psalm 51 as he recognized his unconfessed sin with Bathsheba. See, David had already seen God take the spirit away from Saul, and he was desperately pleading with God not to take it away from him because he understood that being in the presence of God is the most important thing that we can have. That's what we're seeking. You see, these men understood that the being in the presence of God is the only thing worth seeking. The only thing. Think about that. It's the only thing that is worth seeking in this life is to be in the presence of God. Now, the problem is this little word. In fact, in the Bible, it's actually listed as a big word a lot of times, and we're going to see that here in a second. But it's actually a little word in our language. It's 3 letters. Anybody want to guess it? This is the problem of being in the presence with God. What is it? Sin. Somebody said it. Good. Now, there's probably other words you could use, but sin. S-I-N. Sin. 3 letters. Sin separates us from a conscious fellowship with God. Why? Because God cannot be in the presence of sin. It's simple. It's one of the most simple things in Christianity. God can't be in the presence of sin. Therefore, when we sin, we cannot be in the presence of God. I can't explain it any better than that. If you're sinning, you cannot be in the presence of God. Now, some of you might argue, yeah, but God is omnipresent. He's everywhere all the time. That's true. But you can't be in his presence. You can't feel and see his glory if you're living a sinful life. It can't happen. It's impossible because sin literally separates us from God. So, Ephesians chapter 2 says it like this. For it is by grace that you have been saved through faith, and this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God. Now, we're going to stop there for a second. Think about that. He literally tells you right here, and he's going to go on to explain it, but he's going to tell you, it is not from yourselves. There is nothing you can physically do to earn the grace of God. But he gives it to us as a gift. And then he goes on and he says, not by works, so that no one can boast. Well, why? Well, yeah, that's important because if I do the good things, it's easy for me to say, well, look what I've done. Then he goes on. He says, for we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. So he says, look, you cannot earn it, but you were created to do the good works. Right? But it's not because of you. Therefore, remember, therefore is the conclusion. What's about to happen? Therefore, remember that formerly you who are Gentiles by birth and called uncircumcised by those who call themselves the circumcision, which is done by the body, by human hands, remember that at that time you were separate from Christ, excluded from the citizenship in Israel and foreigners to the covenants of the promise, without hope and without God in the world. He says, look, you were Gentiles. You had no access to God at all. None. Zero. It's the same access we have when we live a sinful life. Zero. For in sin, we cannot be in the presence of God. We have zero access. But here's the great part. Verse 13. He says, but now, in Christ Jesus, you who were once far away have been brought near by the blood of Christ. Jesus literally died for all of our sins so that we could be in the presence of God. Because without Jesus, we can't be in the presence of God. You remember the Holy of Holies? The high priest had to go in there once a year, and he had to go through this ritual cleansing. It took days for him to get clean. There was set out things that he had to do. He had to be completely clean. Then he went inside the Holy of Holies to light the incense and to do the sacrifices and the offerings for the year, right? But they tied a rope around his leg so that in case he died while he was in there, they could pull him out because nobody else could go in. You literally cannot be in the presence of God if you are not completely clean. Sin is what makes us unclean. Our sin literally separates us from Christ. God cannot be in the presence of sin because he's too holy. Now, if God is love, and we can all agree with that, right? God is love. If God is love, then we know that he was motivated by love when he separated himself from mankind. Now, wait a second. If he loves us, why would he separate himself from us? Well, we might start by asking ourselves what the results of a holy God being fully manifest to sinful people would be. After all, our God is a consuming fire. Hebrews chapter 12, right? Hebrews chapter 12 says God's a consuming fire. So if we were sinful people and he came in our presence, guess what would happen to us? We're gone. And no evil can dwell in him, Psalm chapter 5. So he can't have evil, so he's not doing it for evil deeds. It was no doubt his mercy that caused him to partially hide himself from us and then later come to us in humility by sending his son, Jesus Christ, and making him human. You know, Emmanuel, his name, Emmanuel, literally means Christ with us. He literally became flesh so that he could be with us. So that we might receive his grace and mercy. He actually sought us out, Luke 19, so that we might seek and find him by grace through faith. So, if all of our patriarchs and all of these people literally think that being in the presence of God is the one thing we should strive for, and we can all probably agree with that sin separates us from that, we want to do that. So, what gets in the way of that for us? Okay, so if you were here 10 days ago, we went through these. We're going to go through them in a little more depth today. I'm going to give you 7 things. Now, we had some really good answers. You know, when I teach a Bible class, I literally make the audience answer some things. And sometimes they go off of my script, and that's great. Because they come up with things that I don't. But these are the things that I came up with. So, we're going to go through 7 things, and we're going to read some scriptures that are going to kind of go with these. So the first one is, what are some things that get in our way? The first one is unrighteousness. We've already kind of talked about this, but let's see what Isaiah says. Isaiah says this, surely the arm of the Lord is not too short to save, nor his ear too dull to hear. But your iniquities have separated you from your God. Your sins have hidden his face from you so that he will not hear. Now, I told you there's a big word that we use. Iniquities is sin. Okay? So, yes, it's a big word here. Isaiah is using it in a poetic form. And iniquities kind of works better in that realm. But sin, the things that we do that separate us from God. He says, your sin has separated you from God, and it has made God hide your face. We've already kind of talked about this, but our sin, when we sin, we literally are taking ourselves out of the presence of God because he can't be there. Okay, so our unrighteousness is first. Second is our pride. And this one, I see the smile on Tracy's face because this is one we talk about a lot, right? And pride can go a lot of ways. So Psalm 10:4 says this, in his pride, the wicked man does not seek him. In all his thoughts, there is no room for God. I don't need God. I can take care of this myself. Right? We might even recognize that God gave us the power to take care of it ourselves, but we still do it ourselves. Right? Or, have you ever heard this one? I don't want to bother God with this little thing. If you say that, I don't think you really understand God. I mean, there's nothing, we always hear, there's nothing too big for God to handle. But I'll tell you, there's nothing too small for him to handle either. Sometimes we get worried and stressed about the smallest little stinking things. Sometimes it's not even the big stuff that terrifies us. It's the little things. It's the minute details. It's the things that we do in our everyday life. And we forget that God cares about that too. That God will be there for us through that too. And that's where we need to go. We need to be thinking, look, get my pride out of the way. Just let me seek him. I'm just going to seek him. I'm going to continually seek him. And if I do that, things will fall into place. Number 3, trusting in human resources more than trusting in God. Now this kind of goes along with pride. It could. Let's look what this one says. Isaiah chapter 31 and verse 1. Woe to those who go down to Egypt for help, who rely on horses, who trust in the multitude of their chariots, and in the great strength of their horsemen, but do not look to the Holy One of Israel or seek help from the Lord. You remember the story of the Israelites taking the Ark of Covenant into battle without asking for God's permission? Right? They said, okay, if we take the Ark, we can't lose. Because every time the Ark is there, we win in resounding fashion. Well, why did they win in resounding fashion? Because God was there. Now, the Ark was technically the dwelling place of God, right? In the tabernacle. But if they didn't have the permission of God to move that Ark onto the battlefield, it wasn't going to do any good. So what happened? They go get the Ark, they take it to the battlefield, everyone, all of them, except for one, gets slaughtered. The whole army. I think it was 3,000 people, something like that. One person survived. You know why that one person survived? So he could go back and tell them what happened. He was the historian. Right? Somebody had to be an eyewitness to what happened or they'd never believe it. And guess what else happened? Oh, the Philistines decided, we're going to take this ark, which has all this power, we're going to take it back to our land. So they stole the ark. And then they became cursed. And eventually they realized they were cursed because of the ark, so they put it on a cart and they shoved it back to Israel. The story gets even better. They get it back to Israel and David goes, yay, we got the ark back, let's take it back. They decide to move the ark in the way that they weren't supposed to move the ark. They get it to a bumpy road. It falls. It starts to fall. Uzziah puts his hands up to stop it from falling. And what happens to him? He's struck down dead. All because Israel decided to rely on their own resources than to turn and look at God. We could probably give Israel a hard time here. We do the same thing. But, man, they saw how God could do the battles. I mean, they went into Jericho and just took everything. Like, there was no resistance whatsoever. Like, they've seen this happen, and yet they still can't trust the Lord. Okay, this next one, if you ever wanted somebody to preach till midnight, this is one that we could preach on in this country. Okay? Now, the idolatry we're going to read about in Zephaniah is a little bit different than what we have today, but we're going to make that correlation. So let's read this first. This is Zephaniah. How many of you have read Zephaniah in the last couple weeks? Anybody? All right. Zephaniah doesn't get read from much. I don't know. This is a good one. Zephaniah chapter 1, starting in verse 4. I will stretch out my hand against Judah and against all who live in Jerusalem. I will destroy every remnant of Baal worship in this place, the very names of the idolatrous priests, those who bow down on the roofs to worship the starry host, those who bow down and swear by the Lord and who also swear by Moloch, those who turn back from following the Lord and neither seek the Lord nor inquire of him. Idolatry. Now, in the Bible, it's really easy to see what the idols are. They're literally, most of the time, other gods. Okay? Even the golden calf is another god, right? Because the Israelites had just come from Egypt where everything had a god. There was a sun god and a moon god and a cat god and you name it. Everything had a god, right? And now we have this, where they built this golden calf and they said, oh, this golden calf brought us out of Egypt. Because for them, the actual idol itself was a god and it was able to do amazing things, right? But our idolatry is a little bit different. Okay? Because if you're sitting in here today, you probably don't believe that there's a different God. You believe there's one God, right? Everybody believes that there's one God? But our idolatry is that we worship things that are not God and we put them in the highest place. Now, we might argue that they're not in the highest place. And we're going to get to a quote about that here in a little bit. We could argue that those things are not in the highest place, but really our actions would show otherwise. Now I'm talking about things like, let's say, sporting teams. Let's say a television show that we might watch religiously. Okay, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying these things are bad in general. Like you can do these things. But it's when it becomes in place of God being number one in your life, and you're seeking those things instead of God. Maybe it's your kids' achievements. Maybe it's your kids' relationships. Maybe it's your relationships. I could go on. I could go on all day and all night. We could just keep naming things. There's all kinds of things that could be idolatry. But what we need to understand is that when anything takes the place of God being number one in our life, that could also mean our spouse, our children, our friends. Are all those things important? Absolutely. But they're not number one. They can never be number one. Okay? But sometimes we make them that. And we have to be honest with ourselves, because sometimes we lie about this to ourselves about where they rank in the hierarchy. We're going to come back to this one in a minute, but let's go on to the next one. Superficial religion. I love this one. Okay, we're going to be in Isaiah chapter 58. Now this is kind of a little bit longer passage, but I'm going to read through this, okay? Isaiah chapter 58, first 9 verses. Shout it aloud, do not hold back. Raise your voice like a trumpet. Declare to my people their rebellion, and to the descendants of Jacob their sins. For day after day they seek me out. They seem eager to know my ways, and if they were a nation that does what is right and has not forsaken the commands of its God. They ask me for just decisions and seem eager for God to come near them. But, let's see what the but is here. Why have we fasted, they say, if you, God, have not seen it? Why have we humbled ourselves if you have not noticed? Yet on the day of your fasting, this is God speaking back to them, you do as you please and exploit all your workers. Your fasting ends in quarreling and strife, striking each other with wicked fists. You cannot fast as you do today and expect your voice to be heard on high. Is this the kind of fast I have chosen, only a day for the people to humble themselves? Is it only for bowing one's head like a reed and for lying in sackcloth and ashes? Is that what you call a fast, a day that should be acceptable to the Lord? Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke. It is not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter. When you see the naked, to clothe them, and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood. Then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear. Then your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help, and he will say, here am I. If you do away with the yoke of oppression, with the pointing finger and malicious talk. You see, what was Israel doing? They were doing all the right things, at least what we saw. They were bowing down. They were fasting. But then they were just going out and doing whatever they wanted to do. My grandfather calls this a Sunday morning Christian. He calls it somebody who shows up to make an appearance. You know what? These same people pray in public so that others might see them praying. Now, that's a great example. I hope that you do pray in public. But I hope you don't do it for others to tell you that you've done okay. Or for others to see what you're doing. You do it because you want to pray to God. You want to be in the presence of God. You see, the Israelites were like this. The Israelites were like this the whole time. They would maybe get a generation or two that kind of followed the Lord, and then they would fall away, and fall away, and fall away, fall away. And we're in the same boat. How about this one? You've got your eyes on the wrong thing. Colossians chapter 3, in verse 1. Since then you have been raised with Christ, set your heart on things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. The Hebrew writer would tell you that you should throw off everything that hinders you and on the sin that so easily entangles you and focus on Jesus Christ, the author and perfecter of our faith. Matthew would tell you that you should store up your treasures in heaven. And over and over and over and over and over and over again, we're told that our focus has to be on the things above. Not the things here, but the things above. We have to be thinking of heaven. We have to be thinking of of Jesus and God and where they are and wanting to be in their presence, because that is how we focus on the right thing. And our seventh thing here this morning is the lack of determination to seek God until he comes. Okay? This one is from Hosea, is where we're going to pull this passage. Chapter 10, verse 12. Sow righteousness for yourselves, reap the fruit of unfailing love, and break up your unplowed ground. For it is time to seek the Lord until he comes and showers his righteousness on you. Is it hard to continue to focus on Jesus? Is it hard to not let the minutia of life get in the way? Because I think it is. I think it's very difficult. So, we're in the middle of a sermon series on how does Jesus change us? So this is where I ask that question. So in the light of seeking God and his kingdom, how does that change us? A.W. Tozer would say it like this. Millions call themselves by his name, it is true, and pay some token homage to him. But a simple test will show how little he is really honored among them. Let the average man be put to the proof on the question of who or what is above, and his true position will be exposed. Let him be forced into making a choice between God and money, between God and men, between God and personal ambition, God and self, God and human love. And God will take second place every time. Those other things will be exalted above. However the man may protest, the proof is in the choice he makes day after day throughout his life. That's the proof. The choices that you make are the proof. You will say over and over, I guarantee you, if I walked up to you right now and I asked you if God was number one in your life, every one of you would resoundingly say yes. I would too. And most days you might live that. Okay, maybe not most days. Maybe part of most days. I don't know. Maybe you do live it. I hope you do. But the problem is that the proof is if we have to choose between those two. Now, the choice is never that easy, right? People don't walk up to you and say, okay, you can have God or you can have money, right? The choice comes in whether or not I should give to God or buy this thing that maybe my family needs or maybe we just want. But we don't think of it that way, do we? We say, okay, my family needs this, so we buy this. So then now it's time to put in the collection plate. Well, we've only got this much left, so that's what's going there. But what the man who chooses God first would say, here's what I have from God. This is what I'm going to give to God, and I'm going to make do with everything else I have left. See the difference? What about between somebody that you love, your family? Is God more important or is your brother more important? Well, Jesus says that there's going to come a time where you're supposed to, leave your father and mother and your brother and them. Let them die, he says, to follow him. So there is a proof. There's a proof here. And we can ask ourselves this. But let me ask you this. Are any of you tired? Any of you feel exhausted? I love how he says this. Tozer's going to say that. We're going to talk about, the rest of this, we're going to talk about the solution. Okay? Do we need rest? Well, of course we do, but here's what it says. Jesus calls us to his rest, and meekness is his method. Stop, just think about that for a second. We did the Sermon on the Mount a while ago. We talked about meekness. Meekness is his method. Let's continue. The meek man cares not at all who is greater than he, for he has long ago decided that the esteem of the world is not worth the effort. Do you get that? He's saying, I don't care who's greater than me. All I want to do is seek him. And I don't need the world to tell me that I'm doing the right thing. I hope you're encouraging your brothers and sisters in Christ when they are doing the right thing. I think we should do that. But we don't need it. I mean, yeah, it feels great. But all we need to know is that Jesus is there. Meekness is what he's wanted us to. We don't need to know that anybody else is greater. The esteem of the world is not worth the effort. We understand who God is, and that is enough. In fact, it's more than enough. He goes on. He says this, the believing man does not claim to understand. He falls to his knees and he whispers, God. He doesn't have to understand. The man of earth kneels also, but not to worship. He kneels to examine, to search, to find the cause and the how of things. Romans chapter 12 and verse 1 and 2 tells us that our life, our entire life is our spiritual act of worship. If you think that you are coming here today to worship, you're correct. But that's not your worship. This is a worship service. We worship together. That's a great thing. We should continue to do it. But your worship is how you live your life. You were supposed to sacrifice your life for him. But I talked about being tired. This is why we're tired. This is why we're exhausted. And that's why this is difficult. He says, the burden borne by mankind is a heavy and crushing thing. The word Jesus used means a load carried or toil borne to the point of exhaustion. Rest is simply the release from that burden. It is not something that we do. It is what comes to us when we cease to do. His own meekness, that is the rest. I love this. Because sometimes we just think, you know what? I am tired, I'm exhausted, I'm worn out, I just need to sleep. You probably do. I can get behind that. I like to sleep. I like to sleep well. But that's not what the rest is he's talking about here. The rest is, I feel the weight of the world on my shoulders because I'm doing everything that I've been asked to do. I'm trying to seek him. I'm trying to do the right thing. I'm trying to help my brother. I'm trying to help my friends. I'm trying to help my enemies. I'm trying to love people. I'm trying to keep the house clean. I'm trying to do the dishes. I'm trying to do. The rest that comes from seeking him is he takes away that burden. He releases us from it. He says, get that out of your mind and focus on seeking me. That's it. That's all he wants us to do is seek him. And he will give us rest. One day we're going to go to heaven and he's going to say, well done, thou good and faithful servants. And he's going to ask us to come and do his rest. He's going to eternally release us from that burden. What a wonderful day it's going to be. Some of us are tired. We're exhausted. But Jesus gives us the rest that we need by telling us that he will take care of it. All we have to do is trust him. One more quote. He says this. To men and women everywhere, Jesus says this. Come unto me and I will give you rest. The rest he offers is the rest of meekness. The blessed relief which comes when we accept ourselves for what we are, when we cease to pretend. When you go out in the world, you don't have to put on your mask. Well, you do right now, the physical one. Making sure you're still with me. But the mask that we cover up our blemishes, we cover up who we are, we try to tell the world we're something different. Why? Because we want the world to tell us that we're doing a good job. We want the world to tell us that we're a good mom. We want the world to tell us we're a good wife or a good husband or a good dad or a good sibling. We want the world to tell us that we're doing great things in athletics, that we're awesome at this or we're awesome at that or we're good at this or we're good at that. That's why we do it. We do it because we want the world to tell us. We want everyone that we see to tell us that we're doing a good job. And we want to believe them when they say it. Because we all know when that phony person comes up to you and they tell you that one thing that you want to hear, but you know they're lying to you. Or at least you think they're lying to you because you don't believe in yourself. We've got to stop pretending. You are his. You are his. And no one can take that from you. But your sin causes you to not be in his presence. And that should be our only goal, is to be in his presence. I promise you, if we spend our entire days trying to be in his presence, we're going to live a fulfilled life, and it's going to be an abundant joy in our heart, because he's going to take away the burden from us and let us just be who we are and do what he's asked us to do. And that's a wonderful thing. there's a way we can help you be more like Jesus today, please come as together we stand and sing.
There